the way that these people are telling their stories that somehow share the same cultural logic that other Jews of their time chose to tell their stories of becoming modern, of, I don't know, their own Bildung stories. And so in that way, they tell the story in ways that echo, I don't know, paths like, for example, Gershom Scholem from Berlin to Jerusalem, but also they directly engage with those other Jewish responses to modernity. The next question that I'm looking at is, so what are the personal, political, and poetic implications of telling your story as a conversion narrative? And, Michal, can you go on to the next one? The argument here is that, in some ways, like there's this experience of disempowerment and failure that comes with experiencing your Jewishness as somehow being defined by persecution, and the conversion conceit is one way to regain agency in the face of this kind of trauma. But I think that trauma also that way of telling your story also comes at a price. We already have that one. And so the point was in argument 3 was that there's something that's being obstructed. That these stories, even though they tell their stories as straightforward stories of salvation and redemption, there are a lot of moments of ambiguity, ambivalence, anxiety, guilt that we can find in these narratives. And so what I'm looking for in these stories are those moments of stuttering, where the narrative kind of falls apart. It doesn't hold on to what it's promising. And then finally, this is a point that I guess I've started. How do they relate to their Jewish past in their stories, and how does that Jewish past shape the way that they understand themselves now as Christians? And this is not just a dialogue they're having with themselves. This is a dialogue they're having with the whole world around them. And one of the most enjoyable parts of this project was looking at the responses that their conversion narratives garnered in the international Jewish press, but not only in the post-war West German press, in the German-Jewish Émigré press in the United States, and of course also behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. And you see how I think that looking at the reception of their stories also gives you a sense of the political stakes of what they're doing. And so let's look at this. I love this. Okay, let's move on. This is a headline from the Forward or Vorwärts, United States. It's a Yiddish kind of socialist-leaning newspaper, daily. And the title that's reviewing Devlin and Hirsch's memoirs is Naya Mishumadim, Kranke Neshamos, was gehen weg von jiddischen Volk. All right, so the new apostates, 6 souls that parted ways with the Jewish people. But, how else would we understand people who converted to Christianity in the wake of this great catastrophe that happened to the Jewish people? These are renegades. These are traitors. And let's look at the next. This is the reception of these works in Eretz Israel in Palestine, 1947. So Hatzofeh Ungerfeld is I think this is an Orthodox. It's an Orthodox publication. Am I right? That's Mizrahi. Okay, so Orthodox Zionist publication that is responding to Karl Jakob Hirsch. This kind of scandalous, the apostasy of the great-grandson of the spiritual forefather of the Mizrahi, maybe, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the Rashar. And this other one is Zeitlin, who's Sifrut Hashmada Chadisha, responding to Stern's The Pillar of Fire. And, so from this general introduction, I want to move into some of the specific characters. And one of the most fascinating ones is, of course, for me, was Karl Jakob Hirsch, the great-grandson, who, grows up Orthodox in Hanover, and leaves that world to become a musician. Later on, loses, his hand gets mangled in some sort of accident, becomes an artist, and is involved with the Communist Party, with the also with different socialist movements, and eventually becomes a novelist. Has to flee the United States in the mid-30s, and comes back to Germany in 1946 and publishes a memoir called Heimkehr zu Gott. It's an epistolary memoir, and of course, I'm curious to ask anyone here, someone would know, how does the epistolary form relate to the ancestors? There's exactly, or Igoltatzafon, I think it is. Can we move to the next slide? It's this is the baptism, but it's the great-grandfather. He wrote his most famous work as this kind of like epistolary theological tractate, and he's trying to convince you somehow that his conversion is a continuation of the grandfather's Orthodox Jewish legacy. And so we have here we have here the Zeugnis, the baptism certificate for him. He called himself Joe Gassner when he came to the States, and he converted 19th of March 1945 in the United States. This had nothing to do with his personal survival per se, right? And he converted in the Second Presbyterian Church. I think it's in the Upper West Side, and he was part of a community that was led by a German-Jewish convert from northern Germany. I'm forgetting the name of the city, right? Breslau, excuse me. And that's sort of gave him community in that world. He comes back the next year, 1946. I've been told that my reading of this is a bit cynical, but I think I'm justified in some way to see this way. That the Heimkehr zu Gott, the story of his homecoming to God, is also an attempt to reestablish himself in Germany and speak to the Germans in a way that he will find some kind of acceptance and a place amongst Germans. And so the next image, of course, is the one of the ancestor, who is kind of in the background of the story. So you see how he needs to incorporate the Orthodox grandfather somehow in his biography, convince us that this is indeed somehow a continuation of that intellectual and spiritual legacy. But it's not only that; it is also, and this is a more of a contemporaneous dialogue. So Hirsch has a twin brother by the name of Gottfried Hirsch, who flees to Palestine. He goes to the States. The brother flees to Palestine. The brother is a convinced Zionist. And of course, somehow the brother is a foil to his own story. So he's trying to, so this is the dialogue that these converts are having with alternative Jewish identities and responses to Nazism, where he's telling us, so this is Karl Jakob, and that's Gottfried. Gottfried moves with his family to Jerusalem. He dies he dies in 44 from some kind of lung infection. And according to Karl Jakob, I don't know if this is the case, he says that he was somehow very disappointed with the Zionist movement towards the end of his life, and that it didn't live up to its promise, and that maybe the death is some kind of like heartbreak or disappointment. Now what happens next in the story is that he himself is hospitalized for 3 months due to a lung infection, and somehow, suffering from the same malady, and he is saved. Somehow that near-death experience is what, again, shows him the light, right? Of course, this kind of like these motifs of sickness and health, blindness, insight, lost and found are, of course, recurring motifs in the conversion narrative. And he uses those, and he finds a way to do what? To like use that paradigm and somehow fit it onto his life. The next image is an image of his niece, the daughter of Gottfried, who sends him a picture of herself in Jerusalem with her son. I didn't try tracking them down. That would also be an interesting story. I don't know what they called themselves when they came here. But those connections, they don't go away. I mean, sometimes they do. But the thing is, like when we think about James's idea of conversion, It's one that supposes that there's a complete break between your old life and your new life. This is not what happens here. Right? There are always these little strings that continue on there. And so this attempt to sort of justify himself to his family, to fellow Jews, is clearly very present there. Can we see the next slide, Colin? And this is a very interesting. I don't know if I don't know if anyone's ever read this novel or seen the film, but this is a 1943 film. It's called The Song of Bernadette. It's based on a novel by Franz Werfel, who is also a Central European Jew who's very attracted to Catholicism but never eventually converted. And Hirsch, in the States, he wrote hundreds of film reviews, and one of them was about this film, which is about Bernadette Soubirous. She is a young peasant girl who sees an apparition of Mary, which leads to the discovery of of Lourdes as being a site for pilgrimage in the Catholic world. And somehow this film left a very powerful impression on Hirsch, and he goes to see this film night after night, and when he's hospitalized, somehow the image of Jennifer Jones as Bernadette Soubirous comes to him and saves him. Now, can we see the quote here? This is him talking about how this film drew him in and showed him the light. Now, of course, as we say in Yiddish, this is exactly what caused the press response. They made simis of him, because this was well, didn't you convert to Protestantism? So what is it about this Catholic miracle film that led you to your chosen religious confession? This is so that's the next, I think, the quote from Mitteilungsblatt. Shalom Ben Chorin is a very important figure in Jewish-Christian dialogue after the war, who this is actually the German press for German immigrants in Palestine, Israel, right? And he's saying the only thing that we learn from this is how deracinated this person is. He didn't have any connection to his tradition. That a film would be what led him to convert. And then there's another one, Walter Mehring. I think he's a composer who worked with Brecht, and he writes for Aufbau, which is the New York, probably maybe we'd say a bit more important than Mitteilungsblatt is for the Émigré press, main Émigré journal for Germans and Central European Jews in the United States. And he points this out. Another person who pointed out the same problem was Thomas Mann, when he in the exchange of letters between them. And here we have, I guess, one of the more problematic quotes from the narrative, where, and I think this is also the key to understanding the appeal of Hirsch's story to German audiences, which is he writes here. This is the night of his baptism in New York. He writes, "Never did I feel a stronger sense of chosenness than on the night I rose from death to life. I experienced the necessity of salvation which every Jew strives for. The Testament of Moses gives only law and not redemption. The Jew carelessly passed over the figure of the Redeemer. Indeed, he delivered Christ to death. This accursed path of the Jew from the cross in Golgotha to the gas chamber in Auschwitz must come to an end. A people cannot be destined by the Creator to exist as victims over the course of millennia. Liberation cannot come from the outside. No political power on earth is able to free the Jewish people from their curse. I know that what I'm doing today is sacrilegious in the eyes of many believing Jews, but I'm obsessed and obliged to do this because there is nothing else for me." So, one thing we can learn from this quote is, there are many things we can learn here, but one is, I think, the depth of the crisis, that he's trying to find a way to retell his story. He was impoverished in the States, his career path was broken, and he's trying to find the right narrative to tell this story of what he went through. And somehow Christ gives him this solution to this path, right? Where he was broken and now he's been remade in the image of a Protestant believer. But the other thing we see here is that he's using what we call this the supersessionist paradigm, right, of like Israel of the flesh becomes Israel of the spirit with the coming of Christ. And that is his story. He embodies that story. But he's accusing, what he does here is how does he frame Auschwitz as a kind of like it's part of a greater theological drama. There's a metaphysical story behind this. And this was a narrative that very much appealed to Germans in the wake of the Holocaust, where everyone's guilty. This is a theological guilt. We're all responsible. We're all culpable. And this kind of like general metaphysical sharing of the guilt is a way to, I guess, exculpate yourself from your own political and individual responsibility for what happens. And that's the reason that I think that this book, when no other survivor stories or returning emigre books were being published in Germany in the early 40s, in the mid 40s, late 40s, or even in the decade to follow, in the 50s, he does find an audience. And he believes that this is going to be the moment where he is going to like reignite the career that was so brutally cut in 1933. And this does not happen. And so if you go to his archives in the Lesesaal Altes Buch at LMU, you will find boxes upon boxes of manuscripts. His devoted third wife, who he met, she was a German woman who was working for the occupying forces. She types out all of his manuscripts, and she's also the one who kind of like conserves his, his nachlass. They're just novels, screenplays, scripts, and none of them, barely any of them were published. He found published a few occasional articles, but there are more letters of rejection. And the rejections are all, they say, okay, you don't understand what it's like to, I don't think you understand the German audience. Or they claim that he's a foreigner in some way. And I want to share with you one of the more interesting, backwards, Michal? No, just the Mutter without the quote. Thank you. So, and this is a story called, it's a novella called Mutter Maria. And this is the story of, he writes this in the late 40s. It's a story of of course, Mutter Maria raises the associations of, the Virgin Mary. And I think it's meant to do that. But the Maria in question is a Holocaust survivor who's been through Theresienstadt. And she comes back after the war, and she reunites with her son, who was of mixed parentage, and so wasn't sent to the camps. His name is Aloysius. Of course, I think this is meant to raise the association of Alyosha in Brothers Karamazov, right? This sort of like more spiritual, forgiving person. And there's this tension between the mother and the son. The mother is just this vindictive, traumatized person. She wants everything to burn down. She can't let go of the crimes that were perpetrated against her. And Aloysius just wants to rebuild his life. And I think that this really captures the psychological and personal drama of Hirsch, who on the one hand wants to let go and rebuild his career in Germany, find a place in the cultural and intellectual milieu of post-war Germany. But on the other hand, to do that, he has to censor himself. There's no speaking of any sense of rage, of resentment. None of that makes it into that memoir that we saw in the previous page. He has to speak in the language of Christian forgiveness, and of course dissociate himself from the very people that he was persecuted along with. And so, in a way, Mutter Maria, this inverted Mother Mary who is vindictive, vengeful, and filled with resentment, is channeling those very feelings that he can't give voice to. She's also, I guess, a cipher of the German, post-war German imagination of how they perceive Jews. Because they, of course, they're not acknowledging their own guilt, and the historian Frank Bies, no, not Frank Stern, Frank Bies or Bies, I don't know how to pronounce the name. He talks about this idea of like the image of the vindictive Jew, which is a bit of a projection. You know, you can't acknowledge your own guilt, but that guilt comes back to you in this fear of what the Jews coming back will do to you. And so Mutter Maria gives voice to that exact fear. And so this is her speaking to a very nice German guy who is the landlord of her son. And he's like, can't bygones be bygones? Can't we just like put the past behind us and rebuild? And she's like, no, none of you are willing to even face the fact of what you've done. This is the rage that's coming through here. And so he dies in 1951, never publishing anything after that memoir that had some kind of success. And the next figure I wanted to look at with you is Carl Stern, the psychiatrist. And we see here that the story is called The Pillar of Fire, right? How his own experience as a persecuted Jew in the war leads him to Catholicism. And I think that the cover of this, the paperback, tells the whole story. So, we see the supersessionist motif with, the Star of David being superseded by the cross. And of course, the pillar of fire here, we see the flame, smoke, and the smoke. Of course, we can think of the smokestack. Maybe the smokestacks of Auschwitz are the pillar of fire that lead him to Christ. And let's look at the next image we call. And of course, Stern, who's a psychiatrist, a clinical psychiatrist, and a scholar and a MD, PhD, is trying to explain what he did. And of course, there's the trying to kind of respond to any suspicion of instrumentalism. And so one of the things that he does is he explains, oh no, the Jews who converted to Catholicism or Christianity during the war, they had it much harder than anyone else because they weren't accepted by the Jews who were persecuted alongside them, and of course the Christian community didn't see them as Aryan. But the problem with that is that he converted in 1943 Montreal, where Catholicism is the hegemonic religion, and there are clearly benefits to becoming Catholic in that context. And so, this is, again, the tension between the story that they tell and maybe the realities or that they don't want to acknowledge. And again, like we saw with Hirsch, there's this ongoing dialogue here with alternative Jewish pasts. Conveniently enough, the brother immigrates to Palestine after being interned in Dachau for a year or two, and the younger brother Ludwig moves to. He's one of the founders of Kibbutz Kfar Sold, and they stay in touch, and so Stern feels compelled to somehow bring the brother again as a kind of foil to his own ideological and religious choice of converting to Catholicism, making his way and settling in Montreal. And so the longhand manuscript of Pillar of Fire starts with what's called a letter to my brother. And so in one sense it's like the letter to his Jewish brother, but to his biological brother, but it's also to his brothers in general. And again, this is kind of like a theological tractate that's meant to justify his own choice of Catholicism while vilifying Zionism specifically as some kind of nationalism that mimics Nazism. So one of the ways that they justify their religious choice is essentially by negating all of these alternative Jewish paths or responses to, modernity or the Holocaust. So Reform Judaism, again, is a very common culprit in the story of the Jews' blindness and the adulteration of their religious vocation. Zionism is debunked as being too secular, as being too nationalist, and this is how they kind of like explain their choice by by somehow talking about their own experiences with these movements or by debunking these other alternatives. Michal, let's see what the next slide is. And so I really do want to finish in another 3 minutes. So I will go through, I just want to quickly show you, what?
It can be 5.
It's okay, I want to hear you guys. And so Alfred Devlin, he returns to Germany in 46 and publishes a memoir called Schicksalsreise, Bericht und Bekenntnis, so the journey of fate, a report, and a confession. And it's essentially what's I think is kind of very suspicious in the story is that it's got 3 books. The first book sort of turns his flight from the Germans throughout, southern France and the emotional crisis he experiences there into this kind of like deep to a spiritual allegory, which completely ignores the political context. And then in part 3, when he talks about his return to Germany, it's very much this kind of like benevolent outside observer, as if he had this catastrophe didn't affect his family, that he didn't have siblings who were murdered in Auschwitz. And so this point of view, these perspectives that he takes are just very misleading, and I think they come across as, it's also the change of voice and perspective comes across as so fragmentary that you see that something's wrong here. And one of the more interesting omissions in the story is, as you can see in the next slide, is his activism for the territorialist movement, which was, during the mid-30s, he finds his purpose as being an advocate for a form of diasporic Jewish nationalism. And we see here his works are published in German. He's active in all kinds of territorialist conventions. His work is then published in translation to Yiddish, Der Ziel und Charakter von der Freilandbewegung. And then in the next slide we see it even makes it to Palestine, where he's published in Turim, which is a literary journal where parts of Jüdische Erneuerung are then translated to the audience in the Yeshuv. And there is no mention of this. And so this is what I mean by, I want to sort of wrap things up here, is that, of course, we have to acknowledge that all works of autobiography are works of selection. But I think that some of the omissions that we find here and the genre that's chosen to tell the story that they tell, there are moments that these stories don't work, and that they are telling stories that are very different than the stories that they think they are telling. And so teasing out those, I guess, that other voice that comes out from the texts was, I think, one of the contributions that this book has to offer. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to any comments or questions or corrections that you might have. Thank you.
Yes.
First and foremost, thank you for this very fascinating account, and I look forward to read it, and very relevant to my own research. I was wondering, in those narratives about the place of the body, of the material body, because as we know, although Nazism had one crystallized theory of the Jewish body, but racism did refer to the Jewish blood, and conversion was, in those cases, it was not a solution for Jews. So I wonder if you spoke about those places where the narratives, they fall apart, those paradoxes where they say one thing but actually remove the other. So I wonder if you found any references to the problem of the Jewish body.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I did, it's not one of the more prominent ways of reading the narratives, but like I did use disability studies. And of course, Karl Jakob Hirsch, he is a very frail man of diminutive stature, who was had his hand was mangled when he was younger. So like physically, he's not a whole body, but he's also a very sick body, a body that betrays him. And of course, you can't not help but think about, these kind of like racial theories and just this rhetoric of of regeneration that Zionists have, but also just like racial rhetoric in Germany and Central Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which sort of plays into his story of his sickness and health. And so, like that body that betrays him is somehow miraculously cured with the embrace of Christianity. He's made whole again. And so I think that's one of the ways that I think you see the body being made present in one of the stories. Regarding where the stories fall apart, I mean, I think that so there's these. So one of the ways, or where the story is different than the one you're telling. I mean, I want to get back to that after we hear around, but just like the psychoanalytic dimension, and maybe I'll return to that in a second.
Yes, please.
Hi, Alfred Bodenheim. I was very interested in reading the critique of Shalom Ben-Chorin and Karl Hirsch. Shalom Ben-Chorin wasn't only a very prominent figure in Israel, became one of the bridge builders to Germany afterwards. And in the 60s, he wrote a book on Jesus for Christians. And he went into quite a long tradition of Jews, especially German-speaking Jews, not only after Abraham Geigel, who discovered Jesus as a Jew, right? And of course, the most prominent of them was Joseph Klausner, the granduncle of Amos Oz, a huge book on biography on Jesus. And he wrote in this book in the 1960s, Shalom Ben-Chorin, that he wrote that der Glaube Jesu eint uns, der Glaube an Jesus trennt uns. The belief of Jesus unites us, and the belief in Jesus separates us. And if you look at what Hirsch wrote and what Shalom Ben-Chorin wrote, they were on not so different tracks actually in understanding Jesus, because he also talked about, of course, about the Holocaust, that it was the way of Jesus that was showing that how he was a Jew, and the Jews were continuing the way of Jesus, in the way of salvation of whatever the world or so. And there was this split at a very specific point where Hirsch believes like Jesus brings salvation, and we have to step out of this Golgotha way. And actually, with the same parallel, Ben-Chorin comes to an entirely different conclusion. So what's interesting is that the ways of those people, in a very large manner, they go together, and they split at a very specific point only. So Hirsch, in some way, he was a heir to a very traditional Jewish thinking on Jesus, that he was Jewish and he wanted to continue his way, but only in a different direction that people like Ben-Chorin wanted to. So I think we have to see that things go like 180 degrees separately one from another, and there is a huge critique, of course, of Ben-Chorin and Hirsch, but after all, the ways are splitting at a very specific point only.
Alfred, thank you so much for that comment. I would say that maybe that's one of the reasons that Ben-Chorin is so critical, both of Hirsch, and then there's also a review of Deblin in Mitteilungsblatt, and that maybe that for him they crossed the line. There's one way to kind of maybe reappropriate our own Christian legacy back into Judaism, but the way that they've embarked on it was not the way that Ben-Chorin thought was the right way. And the other is that I think that this text is, what he was saying in that quote was very different from what Ben-Chorin is looking at. There's no mention of Jesus being Jewish. There is a mention there of deicide, of Jews killing Jesus, and that somehow the responsibility for that translates into the gas chambers, right? There's this direct connection that he makes between Golgotha and Auschwitz, which I don't think would have been acceptable to Ben-Chorin. But I do agree that in both cases there is this kind of there is a, like, the question of German-Jewish reconciliation is definitely implicated in a theological language, and that's something that they definitely share. And that was, of course, very important for Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust as well. It came from, at least this is how, I agree with this, Hanoch Ben Pazi says that he thinks Jewish theological response to the Holocaust is somehow an outgrowth of Jewish-Christian dialogue. So that would be another way to frame her story.
Thank you. Just one question to clarify. Going back to your wonderful presentation, there were moments in this presentation in which it was clear that for those that maybe not all of them, but you could see that in the writing, the way you think about it, conversion has to do something with immigration. So the two are related. The story of immigration is also the story of conversion. There are other moments in which actually the story of conversion relates to Heimkehr, to going back to their origin, going back to Germany, going back to the German society. So it's not about immigration, it's about return. So if you could tell me, how does the conversion, because, if they use the concept of conversion either as a tool to talk about, to identify, to organize their story of immigration is one thing. If they use it as part of their organizing method about Heimkehr is another. If they do both, then maybe, you talked about, that maybe your reading is cynical, maybe your reading is not cynical enough. Okay?
Well, I think here's the thing. The conversion takes place at a certain time, but then there's the moment where they tell the story of the conversion. I think that that's the defining criteria for how to understand. And so the Schicksalsreise of Dublin, I think that this is one way to commune with the German, with the post-war German public, is by by assuming this identity of a Christian, right? This is the bridge that can bring us together. I may not fit, the racial definition of a German, but we share the same faith, and of course, like post-war Germany is just imbibed with like religious belief. The churches have a very important role in Reconstruction and in like they are the one institution that sort of salvages some kind of moral authority. Whether that's justified or not is another conversation. But this is one way for him to commune with his potential audiences. And the interesting thing is, it fails completely. Like he acknowledges this in his diaries. There's this great gap or dissonance between that public persona and the letters that you see he's writing to other people and the diaries that he's writing to himself, where everything that he doesn't say to others is somehow comes through. And Hirsch, 2 years after he publishes Heimkehr, he writes another memoir which completely retracts the conversion or its significance. It was never published in his lifetime, where he says essentially, Pastor Frederick Farrell, he took advantage of me at a time when I was especially vulnerable, and I don't think you understand my conversion. Actually, it was just a reaffirmation of my pre-war socialism, because who is, it's Christ is the quintessential socialist, and so you misunderstand everything I told you before, right? And so you see how fluid these identities are and the stories that they tell of their lives. About their lives in relation to like facts on the ground, what's happening. He's rejected by the Germans. He has this new promised land. He wants to go back to East Germany, or not go back, but migrate to East Germany. He's way too frail or sick to do that, but he's constantly like revising his story to keep up with his actual circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Ram. Just want to ask if you could situate the narratives that you put forward here within a longer German-Jewish tradition of thinking about conversion, because ultimately the question of this endless suffering and the purpose of it all goes back to the pre-Holocaust periods. You have all the 19th century debates on where the children of Moses Mendelssohn went, and Heine and the parents of Karl Marx. There was always this sort of touchy issue of does emancipation lead eventually to sort of higher rates of conversion? So do your protagonists deal with this sort of like a earlier tradition, or do they find themselves part of it in some way?
Absolutely. They respond to that story that's told about specifically the cynical reading of emancipation and assimilation as representing a kind of adulterated, inauthentic form of Judaism. And one of the ingenious responses to it, or the ingenuity of some of these narratives, is the way they align themselves with this kind of post-emancipatory point of view, where they're saying, oh, you know, they present the conversion to Christianity as a rebellion against German-Jewish liberalism. This wasn't a true Judaism. My Judaism is the true Judaism. My Christian being. And another way of thinking about this in relation to that kind of like history of you know, this path towards emancipation and after is Arendt, who, for her, in a narrative that I find very compelling, she says that, and I think it's a very Zionist reading of emancipation, which says that Jews sought to respond to this challenge on an individual basis rather than a collective one, right? And she also has that story of like the blindness, and they too, in all those stories, they accuse the Jews of being blind to their own fate. And so, in this way, it's just like the echoes of, you know, Shoalit Kuma that you find in kind of like Zionist perspectives on the Holocaust and on the aspirations of acculturation and integration, even in like fiction by Aaron Appelfeld, it's there too. And so they're clearly aware of this problematic legacy, and they're trying to situate themselves within that conversation, right, of why they are not on the side of the villains, or at least like the dupes. And of course, what better way, when you talk about blindness and insight, politically, this also works well with the conversion motif, of course, where you've seen the light. And so the theological insight that they find is superimposed on the political question. Oh, there's another one.
Oh, so.
The conversion, it was a phenomenon or specific of individual cases or people. It was occurred before the war, during the war, after the war, the Second World War, and if
Should that be the last question? So we can.
No, I will.
Oh, you have your response. Okay.
Yeah, I have
All
a
right.
question.
Okay. Right. So I thank you for that question.
And B, why to Catholicism? Why do not for Protestantism section?
All right, I'm going to answer that second question first because it's the easier one. Right, the choices are completely arbitrary. You could say it just depends on the contingency of where you ended up and who brought you to where you found a home. I think that what the more interesting question to ask is, after you've found your confession, how do you justify that and fit that into like the facts of your life? And so that's, in some cases, the explanations are, you could psychologize them. Carl Stern grows up in a very Christian, Catholic, conservative part of rural Bavaria, where it's like the religion of his youth. He was not Christian at the time, but there was something of a homecoming. And all conversion narratives, you think about St. Augustine, is like by embracing Christianity, he returns to the mother. Right? And so there's a circular structure to conversion, which also fits with the point of remigration, which I think feeds into the story. Now, about there were, I think, like the historian Todd Endelman says that there were like a few thousands of Jews who, after the war or after they found refuge, decided to convert to Christianity. And he understands this as, this is a stigmatized identity that has caused you so much harm, and if you were already relatively disconnected from the tradition, conversion was one way to just find some kind of distance from this stigmatized identity that was the cause of so much prejudice. They thought that was the solution to the problem. And so in that sense, I don't think it was particularly common. It existed, but the people that are here, I was interested in how they, not about the prevalence of the story so much as how they tell the story of what they did, right? And how they justify what they did and how they talk to other options that are available to Jews after the war to explain what happened to them and to, I guess, heal. So that's the main point. So, but I do, in the book, there are places where it does relate to the historical phenomena. But for them, it wasn't about the Endelman takes an instrumental point of view. Here, I'm not interested in whether, well, I am a bit, but it's not the question of whether this was for convenience or conviction, because sometimes those two aren't in conflict. They might not even have been aware that of the, they're suppressing some of the more instrumental motivations that they had.
Okay, I want to ask a question and a little bit also make a remark upon the reading of the book. So you tell the story from basically a Jewish perspective, and of course you have in some way Jewish characters or characters that began their life as Jewish, and also the book advocates that these individuals are part of, I don't know how you want to frame it, let's begin by German-Jewish. I understand the way you make it, and I think you make it very well. But upon reading the book, I was also thinking there is another part of the story, which is the Christian part.
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective, maybe these characters could play a more positive role than what you present in the book. So my question and remark is, after or during the war, already in the 30s actually, there is in France, and I don't know so much in Germany, a very famous Catholic movement called ressourcement, which is basically a lot of Catholic intellectuals that are going back to biblical, but also sometimes Jewish sources, in order to renew what they think Catholicism has become. I'm less familiar with the Protestant side, so I won't speak about it. There are very prominent figures. Some of them feature in your book, like Jacques Maritain, and so on. This is really one of the products, and he was married with a Jewish woman. And to a greater extent, I believe that ending with, of course, Nostra Aetate, the question of the relationship of Catholicism and maybe more broadly Christianism with historical Judaism in the past, but also in the 20th century, becomes really a defining feature of contemporary Catholic and I believe also Protestant theology. in that sense, I believe that this figure that tries to, maybe in a very brutal and sometimes instrumental ways, try to invent this Judeo-Christianism and a Christianism that is rooted in something Jewish. This is something that is not really acknowledged enough in the book, because I believe that this is really something new that is happening in Catholicism, and I believe also in Protestantism, because before this period, the idea that the Catholicism was deeply rooted in historical Judaism was shared by only very few intellectuals. And after that, this becomes a prominent feature, or more prominent feature, of leading trends, not of all the trends, but of leading trends of the church, and especially during the Vatican II. So I believe the other side of the story has also to be told in some way.
Ah, thank you, Cedric. I think that's a great point, but I just like to explain why it might not apply to those specific figures. So I think that maybe thinking about these figures from that broader perspective could give you that kind of contrast of roads not taken. But here's the thing. I don't think any of these figures thought of that, assumed that role for themselves. They did not see them. There were converts that saw themselves as more as mediators, right? Between, there's, and I can think of two of them. One ended up in.
They all have the story that they want to keep something Jewish in their Christianism.
Right, but their discourse of Judeo-Christianity,
Yeah.
I think that it's very morally problematic,
Yeah,
because
that's another
the
question.
way that they use it is to exculpate fellow European Christians, where they say in ways that, oh, you were actually the ultimate victims of the Holocaust, not the Jews. It's this kind of supersessionist model that says, again, applying the supersessionist logic to the Nazi persecution. So Jews, they were just the beginning. They were the siftach. And that the people that the Nazis actually wanted to go after were the Christians, but first they needed to see that they could finish off the Jews. And so turning the Christians into the ultimate victims of the Holocaust is very present in those stories. And also the choices that they made, like Kronstein in his memoir, we didn't really get to talk about him. He goes to there's a part of the story takes place in the Maria Laach Abbey, which, of course, Hayadu L'Shimtza, that's the place where I think you have Catholic leaders announcing that that there's some sort of some sort of common grounds between Nazism and Catholicism, and there's a reconciliation moment there where he talks to the abbot, who explains what happens, and Uva Letzion Goel, right? Everything is everything is fine after that, right? So there's some kind of very insidious workings in these stories, which I think prevent me from saying, oh, these are figures of these people have a positive role. No, because they vilify fellow Jews in ways that draw on like stereotypes of Jewish materialism, of like ideas of Wagnerian, like incompatibility, that the Jews are incompatible with Western or with German culture. All of that comes up. They apply that to their perspective on Jews. And so I don't think that leaves room to see them as people who are going to mend relations. At least not these specific figures.
Another question?
Thank you very much. I have a slightly different question about what I understood from you about, especially Hirsch, I guess, Berlin had to deal with similar tension when we had a question about migration, is, the fact that they didn't only convert, but they actually re-migrated to the country, right? Which you frame, or at least I understood framing you as a little bit of a more instrumental thinking about how you might find the public. I was wondering about the other way of finding some composure. If you look at life narratives of Jews who return to Germany, right? They all have to grapple with the question of how come we came back, right? Everyone accuses them. There's a cherem on Germany. So how do you read that? Is that also a reading in Hirsch that he tries to, for himself, to justify himself for returning to Germany? Not so much about, commercial or a dialogue with the Germans, but for himself, where he returns to the place where he has been, and he probably has his reasons why he wants to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Start a new career somewhere.
Well, okay, so this is, they position themselves as, we're German, we had to flee because of the political conditions, the circumstances, but we're here to help rebuild. Mm-hmm. They're kind of like these benevolent figures that that have decided to put the past behind them and commit themselves to reconstruction. It's
and so part of his, for example, when you mentioned his novel that hasn't been published, this Rage, you framed it as Rage, but it also is that part of his mission to rebuild. Again, it goes back to the typical German-Jewish narrative after the war, right? We're here, or the returners narrative. We're here to rebuild Germany. How do we do it? If we rebuild a better society, right? We either strengthen democracy, and how do we do it? By telling the Germans, you have actually solutions to it.
Oh, no, there's no talking about, no, they adopt, at least in the case of, so this is the weird thing about for example, Deblin, who, he attends the Nuremberg trials. I think that he's also very involved in doing this kind of the re-education campaigns. He's a censor. He approves what's going to appear and what isn't. And he also is, he establishes a cultural journal, right? I think it's called Das Tor. This Goldene Tor, right? But in the memoir, there's no confronting the readers with this. It's kind of like he uses the images that he uses to describe the German catastrophe is like Mount Vesuvius erupting, right? Like a natural disaster. No one's responsible for that. Or the Book of Lamentations. Again, this is like a divine drama, this like divine fury that fell upon the Germans, but no question of what you guys did. And Günther Anders, he writes, the ex-husband of Arendt, who's like this cultural critic and theorist of technology. He writes that, this is also the reason why the Germans, they loved Kafka after the war, because it presents this image of the world, everyone is guilty. No one is. If everyone's guilty, no one's responsible. So yes, they did have to. I completely agree. It's like, the Heinrich Kronstein memoir. It's called. It's called Briefe an einen jungen Deutsche, right? So it's like letters to a young German. So again, it's like, let us make Germany great again, right? And it's a very Christian conservative point of view. So their identification lies with the Germans, at least in three of those narratives, the ones that were written in German. I think the ratio of minutes to attendees is
I want to
is
close.
perfect.
No, I want to tackle you with another question. There is also another point that I found very illuminating in your book, is the absence of response of post-Nazi society to this invitation of these four Jews.
Mm-hmm.
can you elaborate a little bit more about the signification it has about these first years of post-Nazi Germany? What can we learn about the post-Nazi society, and the fact that there are people that want to make it good again, Wiedergutmachung, and actually they don't want to hear them. They don't want to even this very selective narrative don't find any
Wiederhall.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so I don't have that much to say about this. I would just say that you see that their past, especially like in the case of Döblin and Hirsch, their socialist credentials were never forgotten, and you see all they say. Okay, you were Jews, left-wing Jews. So there's this trope. It just fits them perfectly. And so in that sense, someone like Hans-Joachim Scheps, who doesn't convert and returns to Germany to become a professor of religious studies, I think he did a better job integrating because, of his political credentials. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's the only thing I think of at this moment.
Any other question? Okay, so thank you very much, Ava.
Thank you so much.